Have you ever wondered what it actually costs to run a country like Canada? Well, it takes a lot of people, and it takes a whole lot of money. Today, we're going to dig into the massive $71 billion price tag of the federal public service. We're going to look at how it got so big, so fast, and ask that really big question: are we, as taxpayers, getting our money's worth? Let's get into it.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We'll start by following the money, that huge $71 billion payroll. Then we'll look at the incredible hiring spree that's been fueling this cost. After that, we'll compare the paychecks of public servants to folks in the private sector. We're also going to unpack a pretty shocking report on the Canada Revenue Agency's performance. And after we hear the government side of things, we'll explore why this massive bill might be a lot harder to shrink than you'd think.
Okay, first up, Ottawa's $71 billion payroll. We're going to follow the money behind what is by far the federal government's biggest single operating cost.
So let's just start with the bottom line, the number that kind of sets the stage for everything else. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the estimated price tag for federal employees this fiscal year is $71.1 billion. It's a massive number for sure, but what's really wild is just how quickly we got here.
Yeah, this chart really tells the story, doesn't it? Just look at that climb. Back in the 2016-17 fiscal year, the cost was just over $40 billion. Now, it's over $71 billion. That's a 77% jump in less than a decade. And to give you some perspective, that growth has completely outpaced Canada's population growth and even general employment growth during that same time.
All right, Section 2, the 100,000 employee surge. So what's driving this insane cost spike? Well, it's not just about salaries going up. The federal government has been on a hiring spree like we've never seen before. Get this. Since 2015, the federal government has hired about 110,000 new employees. That works out to a nearly 43% increase in the size of the workforce. I mean, we're not talking about a little adjustment here and there. This is a fundamental expansion of the government's administrative arm.
And this growth, it wasn't spread out evenly at all. Some departments just exploded. The Housing, Infrastructure, and Communities Department swelled by an unbelievable 375%. Women and gender equality, up 334%. And even the huge departments, like the Canada Revenue Agency, brought on over 13,000 new people.
On to Section 3, a tale of two paychecks. You know, this massive hiring boom naturally leads us to a pretty thorny topic: compensation. We're talking about the gap between what federal employees are earning and what the average Canadian worker is taking home. So the key thing to wrap your head around here is the idea of total compensation. In 2023, the PBO calculated that the average total compensation for a full-time federal employee was $148,000. Now, that includes everything: salary, pension, benefits, the whole package. How does that compare to the average Canadian worker? Well, according to StatsCan, their average annual wage was under $70,000. So yeah, more than double.
And when you really start to dig into the numbers, you see that it's the benefits that create this huge divide. Almost 87% of government workers have a workplace pension. Compare that to less than 22% in the private sector. And check this out. Defined benefit pensions, the gold standard for retirement, nearly 80% of federal employees have one. In the private sector, less than 9%. You add in more personal days and retiring earlier, and the picture becomes crystal clear.
This trend is just as dramatic when you look at salaries alone. Back in 2015, you had about 43,000 federal employees earning a six-figure salary. Fast forward to 2024, and that number has more than tripled to over 146,000. That means today, almost 40% of the entire federal bureaucracy is pulling in a salary of $100,000 or more.
Okay, moving on to Section 4, the 17% accuracy problem. With all these costs and compensation numbers going through the roof, you just have to ask the question: what are we getting for it? What about performance? So let's use the Canada Revenue Agency, which, remember, saw a huge staff increase, as a little case study.
This is really the core of the issue, isn't it? We have a public service that's much bigger and much more expensive. But are the actual services that Canadians depend on getting any better? Well, a recent report from the Auditor General gives us a pretty jaw-dropping answer. 17%. No, you heard that right. Let that sink in for a minute. According to the Auditor General, when her team tested the CRA's call centers, the agents only gave the correct answer to individual tax questions 17% of the time. To put it another way, for every 6 questions they asked, 5 of the answers were wrong. And honestly, the full report paints an even bleaker picture.
For questions about business taxes, the accuracy rate was basically a coin flip at 54%. And that's if you could even talk to a human being in the first place. Only about a third of the calls even reached a live agent. So it really makes you wonder, what is the connection between hiring 13,000 more people at the CRA and these terrible service levels? It's a huge part of this whole debate.
All right, now for Section 5, the official rebuttal. Because, of course, there are always two sides to a story like this. So what did the government in the CRA have to say about these findings?
The government's main defense really came down to methodology. You can see it here in this quote from the Secretary of State for the CRA. They basically argue that the Auditor General's sample size of 167 calls was just way too small to be a fair snapshot of the 30 million calls the agency gets every year.
And this slide really sums up the whole dispute. On one side, you have the Auditor General's external audit, which found that shocking 17% accuracy rate. But on the other side, the CRA points to its own internal review of 100,000 calls, which they claim shows a 92% accuracy rate. It's a classic battle of dueling statistics.
It's also really important to remember the context for all this growth. The government has argued that major events and new policies are the reason behind it. They point to things like the incredible effort needed for the pandemic response, rolling out huge new national social programs, and just dealing with an increasingly complex regulatory world. All of that, they say, required more hands on deck.
And that brings us to our final section, the unshrinkable bill. So where do we go from here? Well, the government has announced plans to tighten its belt, but the numbers suggest we might be heading for a very strange paradox.
The official plan is to shrink the public service by about 40,000 jobs over the next few years. They plan to do this mostly through attrition, which is a fancy way of saying they just won't replace people who retire or quit. On the surface, that sounds like a pretty logical way to cut costs, right?
But here's the twist. The Parliamentary Budget Officer is actually projecting that even with fewer employees, the total personnel cost is going to increase. It's expected to hit $76.2 billion by the 2029-30 fiscal year. How is that possible? Well, it's because the average compensation per employee just keeps climbing, and it's projected to hit $172,000 by the end of the decade.
And that brings us right back to our central $71 billion question. The data shows us a public service that has grown much bigger and much more expensive, and there are some really serious questions about its performance. But the simple-sounding solution of cutting jobs might not actually cut the cost. So if cutting jobs won't cut the bill, what will? It's a really complex puzzle that gets right to the heart of how our government works.